I don't want to say that these groups that we call cults are necessarily a bad thing. I'm not interested in the pathology. I think sometimes often these groups appear and they're compelling both to the people who join, and then we can also talk about ourselves as viewers, and an audience for the kind of media around them. They do a kind of necessary work. They give people what is missing in their own lives and they can't find anywhere else.
Well, Poulomi, thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate having you here on the podcast. I was very interested in talking to you because I found you when I was researching cults. And I thought you had an approach to cults that I had never really seen before. And I just thought it was really fascinating. And I wanted the chance to talk to you and hear your perspective about it first. But for anybody who's listening, in some of your interviews, I heard you say something that I thought was really interesting. And I have a quote here from you that I believe came from an interview you might have done with Berkeley. I'll link the article that I got it from. But you said, "I'm not interested in diagnosing cults, but rather in understanding how groups and beliefs come to take on that name and all the feelings and reactions that come with it." And I know that in today's world, cults are they're very much like a pop culture phenomenon. You know, everybody wants to read about it's almost like true crime. It's like everybody wants to know about cults in this very pop culture way, but you seem to approach it from a very understanding sort of way and much less of a trend sort of way. But enough for me. Tell us about yourself and how you got involved in this area of study and everything else.
Sure. And I'm delighted to be here. And the fact that you bring up true crime, we should come back and talk about the overlaps between true crime and cults.
Absolutely.
Because it's not an accident that you see the connections between them. But it is true that I have become a cult expert, I guess, in the last few years, unexpectedly. And without meaning to, have become a person who does have a rather unorthodox view of cults. And I say unexpectedly become a cult expert because I'm an English professor, and that is not necessarily a natural trajectory for what I do. But I, in some ways, came to cults the same way that, as far as I can tell, tens of millions of Americans have, which is that the idea of them has always kind of tantalized me in ways that I didn't quite understand, but did not fully take hold of me until just before the pandemic, and then really the early days of the pandemic lockdown. I joined this huge group of people for whom a daily watching of the countless cult podcasts and documentaries became how I measured my life, right? When you don't have to go to work and you can't leave your house, those Netflix documentaries and their 48 or 52-minute blocks become the structure of your life. And I noticed a few things. One, that my long-standing sense of myself was starting to change. I have long thought of myself as a reasonable person. And I say that partly as a kind of self-identifier of being a person who's led by, as an academic, by my own thoughts, by theory, by science, by facts, but also this self-conception that there is a kind of person who joins a cult, and I am as different from that kind of person as possible.
Wouldn't we all think so?
Right? And the word I gave myself was reasonable. And it's that reason that started to shift. And I found myself asking new questions about what I had the capacity to want and feel. And so cults became this kind of portal to imagining new ways of being in the world and understanding myself. And it was utterly startling. I did not expect to think that cults would change how I saw myself.
Yes, cults are when you first start researching cults or getting into cults or watching things about cults, it's an us versus them feeling. It's
Absolutely.
like, I'm watching them because I can't imagine what it's like to be that person. And then once you deep dive, you start to realize, oh, I not only am I that person, but I might currently be that person in ways that I didn't even understand. That's fascinating.
And there's a reason for that. The reason is actually why I have this different perspective on cults. The reason that we are primed to believe that we are not like them, right? There's a kind of plural us and them over there, is because of the word cult and what it does. So part of what I argue, both in my research, but also in this incredibly popular class that I teach, which is a secret philosophy class, but it's a class about cults and popular culture.
Mm.
And part of what I argue there is that the word cult is not so much a thing as an entire narrative structure. That when you
Mm.
say, is that a cult? Or that is a cult. What you're actually doing is you're unleashing this ready narrative that we all think we understand. And the story goes
Right.
something like a new amazing thing appears that seems to magically speak to some people. And usually that new amazing thing is headed by a charismatic figure. Some people are drawn to that thing. They are drawn to it for reasons that people who aren't drawn to it can identify. People who aren't drawn to it will say, oh, that person is lonely, or that person is gullible, or
Right.
that person is not well, right? There's all these kind of pathologies around the person who joins this group. So already we've got this us and them.
Right.
I am not susceptible to this new amazing thing. But for the person who is, what that does is it takes a feeling of being wrong, of not quite fitting in, not having your needs met, being dissatisfied, being an outsider, and it suddenly by magic disappears it because you have this person or this group of people who turn to you and say, you're not wrong. It's okay. You belong. You're like us. Come on over here. That nagging feeling inside of yourself that no one seems to understand, we get it. And not only do we get it, we understand where it comes from and we can make it go away. And so a person who is hailed in this way suddenly is subject to a kind of transformation. They get to go from being wrong to be having access to a secret, a transformative secret. And once you're inside, you find all sorts of things that seem to be totally devoid in our everyday life. Radical acceptance.
Right.
Belonging.
Yes.
Structure. We live these lives where our lives are so complicated. Everything we have to do is hard.
Yes.
Being an adult, my students keep telling me, is very hard. And I, as somebody who's been an adult for decades and decades, I agree. So you have, if life is so challenging, to be offered simplicity and totalizing answers is incredibly compelling.
Right.
So you have these people who suddenly have what feels like everything they've wanted offered to them. Now, they still live in the world.
Right.
So they may have these kind of extraordinary transformative experiences, but then they go home to their families and they're like, I have to tell you about this person who is divine, or who is a revolutionary, or who is going to save the world. And the people that they love or they're friends with or they live near will say, that's nuts.
Yeah.
Now, faced with these two things, what are you going to do? You're going to go back to being wrong and nuts, or are you going to go back to the place where you belong and there's meaning?
Right.
So we've started to create this kind of insularity of us and them, where once you're inside, why would you want to come back outside? The outside doesn't have that much going on, honestly, right? If you're having so many of your needs met inside. Now, The part where we get real culty is that because we cannot see, those of us who are outside, what is inside, we can only speculate, and we begin to speculate on often real things. That inside insular communities, you don't have the kinds of checks and balances we want to imagine exist in society. So there can be forms of exploitation, there can be forms of violence, it can be very difficult to leave. But inside that insularity, as much as there are those negative things, there can also be revolutionary change. There can be miraculous connections. There can be love and joy and salvation. All of those things can happen inside. When things start to go wrong, when that insular community is cracked open by scandal, by the government, and we can talk about that, by family members seeking to rescue their loved ones, that's when the word cult comes into play.
Right.
Not when things are good.
Right.
Not when things are revolutionary. When we start to have to locate a problem. Then we have this other part of the story that then things will get catastrophically bad. And we have historical examples of this. The one that everyone turns to always is Jonestown, right? What happened to the People's Temple becomes this kind of object lesson of cults. Things go catastrophically wrong. And that thereafter, that thing becomes an object lesson against buying into the miraculous cure, the charismatic leader, the community that seems to accept you unconditionally. In retrospect, all of the good things become something different. So the word cult is an incredibly insular word, right? It doesn't give you a lot of room to move.
Right.
It supplies you with all the things you're supposed to know and think and feel: fear, hope, disgust, repudiation. But it doesn't actually get at the really complicated stuff in between. And so my interest is not in asking whether or not something's a cult. My interest in asking things like, what happens to people in these groups?
Right.
Why do they join? That's a question we've always asked. But the new question that I've been asking is, why should people leave?
Right.
If all of these needs are being met, what is our demand on the outside that people leave?
Right.
What can we offer them that they're missing?
I think another question that people might have, and I'm interested to see your thoughts on this, is it only a cult once things go bad? Or is there an example of a cult that was in fact a cult, but nothing ever went bad for those people, or there were no negative outcomes? In my opinion, because I've been looking, I have never found one that didn't at some point, maybe years down the line, become out of control for whatever reason. Maybe it's the person who started its child took over and they were the bad one, or maybe they started asking for money and now people are broke and they're trapped in these. But is that what separates a cult from a non-cult? Is the idea that maybe there are groups like this that just help people and therefore are not considered a cult, but maybe should be. But since nothing has ever gone wrong for the people, what do we consider them then?
Well, I think we get back to, what's the point of calling it a cult? What work does that word do? Clearly for us, as like kind of shared understanding, it has to include the part where it goes bad.
Right.
Because if it didn't, then we wouldn't have this story. We'd have no shared understanding. It would then be a utopian community. It might then be a religion. It might be a self-help group. There are all kinds of other names that we give insular, intense, intentional communities. Cult is the word that we use to diagnose. Now, it's a useful word because it often says, hey, look over here, there's something happening that is familiar to you. But it's not really a descriptive word. Right? So I'm interested in thinking about, how do we disaggregate what we think a cult is from what we worry about with a cult. That is, I don't want to say that these groups that we call cults are necessarily a bad thing. I'm not interested in the pathology. I think sometimes often these groups appear and they're compelling both to the people who join, and then we can also talk about ourselves as viewers, and an audience for the kind of media around them. They do a kind of necessary work. They give people what is missing in their own lives and they can't find anywhere else. So there's a lot of value there, and I want to take that seriously. I want to take seriously how people are loved and changed. People write to me all the time to talk about what happened to them in these groups and the deep pain of having to leave. And our story about cults that we've inherited doesn't give people room for that. So I want to open that up. But I also think we would be wrong to simply romanticize these groups.
Right.
We need to identify things like material harm, right? We need to actually ask, what's wrong with this group? What is it that makes you want to call it a cult? Now, take something like Warren Jeffords, which was a fringe of the Church of Latter-day Saints, and they engaged in child marriage, sexual abuse, right? I'm happy there to think about how those material harms, which flourish because it's an insular community where one person or a small group of people are endowed with a kind of inordinate power, a divine power, and are able to kind of run roughshod over people. I'm really happy to think about those material harms, what happens inside, our own reactions to what happens inside, our sense of what we can understand. But the word cult in and of itself doesn't do that much for us. It's really a kind of placeholder for a lot of much more complicated questions and forms of analysis.
And I think it also devalues experiences as well, because I speak to many, many, many survivors on a regular basis. And I think you're absolutely right when you say the word cult, because it is such a buzzword, for lack of a better term, it doesn't really give them the opportunity to say, but the first however long that I was involved in this group was actually wonderful, or that's how I met my husband, or I still wouldn't trade that part of the experience for what came later.
Or the fact that people sometimes leave these groups and still believe in their tenets. This is actually really important. Like, we need to account for the fact that we who think of ourselves as not people who would join a cult believe that when you leave, a person should repudiate all of the things that happened before. We have this kind of like schadenfreude where we want people to be punished. We want people to feel the kind of cost of leaving in a particular kind of way. And there's a reason for that. And I think the reason is that because cults, or the things that we call cults, often offer what is absent in everyday life, those of us who navigate everyday life often feel a feeling of, why should you feel like you can get it all? If I live constrained desires every day,
interesting,
shouldn't you? Shouldn't there be a cost to your however long experience of something that seemed to be so fulfilling? We want people to suffer in the way that we suffer. And I think we do all suffer in our small and large ways in life. And so there is this real desire to punish people. And so it really does silence, and I think limit, people's ability who have been in these groups to talk about what happened to them, to talk about their beliefs, because they feel a kind of social disapproval. One that's strangely matched to the fact that we may disapprove, but we're going to watch. We have a favorite cult, right? That contradiction is a really complicated one. What is it about that I have students who are like, I have a favorite cult, and I think, okay, cool. And then they'll say, but people shouldn't join. I'm like, but you love it. You claim to love something, and you want to actually punish or repudiate the person who will fully experience the thing you claim to love.
Right. Don't do it, but if you're going to do it, film it so I can watch it. Don't do it, but if you are going to do it, put it on TikTok, put it on YouTube, put it on Amazon Prime. I really want to watch this with the distance to be able to say, but I never did it. I'm not one of those people. I'm just curious.
Yeah, I mean, well, the fantasy there is that we can watch and listen and go on these deep dives down Reddit rabbit holes and listen to all the podcasts and feel fully immersed, because that's what the media does, because it takes a page out of true crime. We want to get fully immersed, but we imagine that we are these like perfect kind of detectives, untouched by the phenomenon.
Yeah.
We actually are the best because we get to see the secret inside and not risk ourselves. A part of what I think we're noticing is that we are risking ourselves. I think those of us, and again, tens and tens of millions of us, watch and listen and get obsessed, and we have been changed.
Yes.
We are porous to the influence of these groups, not necessarily in a bad way, but we have to recognize that we have shifted how historically cults have been figured into a new thing where now we welcome them into our lives. We announce a kind of investment in them. This was never true before. In the 1960s and 70s, which was a kind of earlier heyday of cults, people wouldn't say, I love that cult. That was impossible to imagine. So clearly, society has changed as a result of this cult obsession.
Yes, absolutely. And is there anything that you've discovered since you've taken this interest in this topic about yourself that was either kind of hard to align with or hard to admit, or maybe it wasn't hard to admit, but it was just very surprising and shocking?
I think part of what this process has been for me is trying to understand what it is I was so girding myself against. When I called myself a reasonable person, what was I afraid of? That's been the real question. And I'm discovering that there are many answers to this, but it is a real challenge to try and understand why you do not want to be affected by something. And part of that is a real fear of losing yourself, right? The thing, one of the ongoing dangers of cults, I think, to especially an American imagination, is the idea that you lose yourself.
Right.
And this starts with a kind of original fantasy. I always tell my students this when we begin, that part of the kind of history of Western modernity from the Enlightenment in the 18th century to the present has been this fantasy that there is this thing that is the human, the individual, who is this contained, fully rational, hence my love of reason, rational person that is an I. I am always myself. I know myself. I am in charge of myself. This is our great fantasy. And protecting that being is the work of life. That we are not supposed to want to lose ourselves in a collective. We're not supposed to want to loosen our grip on reason and maybe feel. We are not supposed to want to be cracked open. We are supposed to want to be contained. And what I think we can all admit is no one is always reasonable, contained, and singular. It's
right.
And being told that that's what you're supposed to be is incredibly agonizing, I think, to many people, because you're constantly going to fail at it. No one is ever going to be a perfectly contained person. So the stranglehold of that fantasy is really hard to shake. Even for me, I mean, I've been working on cults and our obsession with them for now almost 5 years. Well, actually 7, as a kind of longer project that's transformed quite a bit. And I still find myself having moments where I kind of firm up in an attempt to say, I am not them.
Right.
Which is where we started.
Right.
But that I is never a solid thing.
Right.
And so the loosening that grip of the I think is like been my kind of ongoing lesson. Like, what would it mean for me to be like, yeah, you know what? I'm not always reasonable.
Right.
I often want more and messier and transcendence. And I might actually start seeking it in places that challenge the life I've built around this I.
Mm. Do you think there are any benefits to finally admitting to yourself, maybe I am very similar to these people, maybe I am somewhat unreasonable? Is there any way that you think someone might be able to benefit from admitting that and moving forward? And then what would that look like?
Oh, yes, absolutely. I think we all need to admit it.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it's actually the first step of understanding ourselves in the world, not just about cults, but thinking about, the political moment we live in, for example.
Right.
Right. I think that we need to actually admit our deep imperfection as in terms of the fantasy of this particular kind of individual. But also that it is a universal fact. No one is that perfect, rational, contained individual. So yes, it's incredibly important. But also when we talk about cults, and we talk about the ways in which cults are not just a thing on TV, but a thing that now we talk about in the political sphere, that recognizing our own vulnerability, our own susceptibility is really important to the cultivation of a particular kind of empathy, and a kind of empathy that lets us really grapple with the fact that cults are a site where people who are seeking something go, but what they're seeking, we're all seeking. So to think about not a kind of false division between us and them, but like actually how modernity has kind of stripped us of a lot of the things that we need. And if we recognize those shared needs, we might actually be able to start to grapple in new ways with like how to be in the world together. I think cults offer a set of lessons. Again, I'm not trying to romanticize the actual violence that can happen inside these groups, but I do think taking seriously the ways in which we have been denuded of so many of the things that we might need and want to thrive is a good social project that cults might inaugurate.
Right. So basically saying by admitting that you're more similar to those people than you're willing to admit, all of us are looking for these particular needs. All of us have these particular needs. All of us need this thing. Some of us go that direction. Some of us go where. What is a way that we can continue to help ourselves, help other people meet these needs that all of us clearly have without necessarily falling into that group or something similar, like a cult type situation that may not be healthy. I wonder if that could be an interesting study in social progress. Like, what are programs we could develop? What are things we could invest in? What are, mental health needs that maybe we have that could, while also combating cults, combat things that all of us are missing, that all of us are seeking.
Absolutely. I think that this, very rarely will I say that I want to offer like a social solution. I think as an academic and a humanist, solutions just aren't what I do.
Yeah.
But I do think that this is as close as I would get to saying that, which is that what you see flourishing, not just inside these groups, but in our obsession with watching and learning about them, will tell you something about what is missing in our own lives. And, I have often people will write to me about themselves, but sometimes people write about loved ones. I get emails saying, can you help me rescue my loved one? They're in a cult. And it's a funny thing in one small way, which is that I teach at Berkeley, and 40 years ago, there were a group of people at Berkeley who were in the business of exactly this. Colleagues who I've never met because they're retired and several of them have passed away, were actually cult experts in the 60s and 70s. And what they worked on was how to get people out of cults. So Margaret Singer, who was in the psychology department at Berkeley, was quite famous because she was a part of the defense team for Patty Hearst
Interesting.
at her trial. And what she offered as a kind of professional account of why Patty Hearst was innocent of her crimes of robbery was that she had been brainwashed by a cult. And what Margaret Singer did for an entire career, and she really did build a rich and important way of understanding language and control and coercion in these groups. But what she did was give rise to this entire world of deprogramming where people are sent to remove usually adults from groups. And the idea is that they're then deprogrammed. It comes out of a Cold War history of a fear of brainwashing and this idea that you can actually change someone's mind and then that mind can be changed back. So 40 years ago, people would write to my colleague at Berkeley and say, can you help me rescue this loved one? And often she would say yes. And her prescription would be to take that person out. And there's a whole psychological process of rewiring the brain to return some original I. Now, when people write to me, that is not what I say.
Right.
And what I say, I realize, is often deeply unsatisfying to the people who write to me. They want a solution. They want help. They're really in a lot of pain. I mean, people come to me because they're desperate. And I often say, this person that you love has found something that was missing in their life. If you are willing to figure out what that is and to give that to them, then perhaps you can talk about the ethics of removing someone from a group. But often that's not possible, and it's not even what you want to do, right? If your parent, for example, has found a group that is meeting all kinds of needs, spiritual needs, social needs, they feel loved and seen, they have a kind of joy and meaning in their life, and their adult children are like, but I miss my parent. And I say, but are you willing to give up your life, your independent life, to be a constant companion to your parent? Would that bring them happiness? If you can't and it won't, then what you're asking of them is to give up something that is meaningful and powerful in their life because you envision a different kind of life for them.
Right.
Of course, the asterisk here is always, again, the question of material harm. These people who write to me often will say, my parent is giving away all of their money. That's not material harm. You may not agree with their actions, but so as long as we do not tip into forms of real violence and exploitation, I think that we need to come up with new ways of thinking about our own sense of loss when someone we love decides that they're going to radically transform their life because they share a belief with a group that we might call a cult.
Right. And then there's also the argument that that's the exact same email that you might get from parents who just don't like who their child is becoming or who their child is dating. My parents might have written you the exact same email when I went through a phase where I shaved my head and became a liberal Democrat. Who knows what they would have said in an email of it, genuinely believing that I probably needed to be rescued or removed from whatever group I was spending a lot of time with. But then you think, is that truly a cult that this person's involved in? Is that truly a toxic scenario they're in? Or like you said, are they just not fulfilling the image that their loved ones had in mind for them? Are they just a different person than what everybody around them wants them to be to make it easier for everybody else? And then once you've answered that question, where do you even go from there, right? Like once you've discovered, is that actually the victim of a cult? Is that just somebody who's striking out on their own and making decisions nobody likes? Then what do you do with that information?
This is the perfect example, right? That it is often very difficult for all of our fixation on the individual, for us to see our loved ones individuate.
Yes.
Right? This is why adolescence is so hard.
Yeah.
Parents struggle, children struggle, but
teenagers are all cult members, if that's the case, right? Like anybody going through puberty is apparently a cult member.
Individuation is really hard to say, I am different from you. I want different things. I feel different things. I believe different things. And I may become unrecognizable to you. It is incredibly painful. I'm not minimizing that pain. But your question of what happens next, the good news is there are examples that aren't simply tragic. There are examples, and part of the joy and the difficulty of the archival work that I do is, sifting through accounts of loved ones kind of grappling with this shift or the loss of someone to a group. And in the era of like the kind of heyday of deprogramming, where it was fairly common for people to hire deprogrammers, people had absolutely no training. This was an absolute fake science, which often had its own extraordinary material harms and violences. But people would do this. And, I was working on a chapter of my book about deprogramming, and I had spent months reading all of these accounts of parents who had had their children deprogrammed.
Right.
And there was something just kind of eating away at me. It was so hard because the accounts of the deprogramming are grueling. It's torture.
It's like conversion camp.
Yeah, it goes to the level of psychological torture. And I would be reading the pain of these people who could not understand how deeply they were hurting the person they loved.
Right.
And I thought, this is just devastating. Like, I can't do this work. And in the midst of it, I came across a person who kind of opened a new world, who writes in this beautiful way about her son joining the Hare Krishnas. She writes this very funny, incredibly large-hearted, smart essay in the New York Magazine. This is in 1978, about her son joining the Hare Krishnas. And it's about how, it was hard and often embarrassing. She'd see him on the street corner in Chicago with his shaved head, singing and dancing, and she would kind of cross the street. But she also saw that her son, who had been lonely and so angst-ridden by the world and kind of unable to thrive, found all this meaning. He started to he was happy. He was starting to do all this work that gave him like a sense of himself. And she and her husband start to visit him. And the entire family really works to try and meet this new person, because he is a new person.
Right.
And try to see this new person not as some betrayal of an old person, but as a person they can love. And it's not easy. And she offers absolutely no like simple solution, but it does offer a model for how we might engage with people who have decided that they're going to live their lives in ways that we find unrecognizable, sometimes disturbing, sometimes unbearable, right? I mean, and I think that's that's like an important thing that we're going to have to also start thinking about as we enter this. We have been in probably the last 10 years in this kind of extended period of like remarkable social partisanship, where the divisions between people and types of people feel impossible.
Right.
And so I think that trying to understand people's desire to be transformed, people's beliefs in what you may not share, as not the ending of a kind of relationship, but the demand that you forge a new one. Again, don't have to agree. You don't have to change your own mind, but you might think about how to relate in a different way and whether or not in that new relation you could both stop being so fixed in your difference.
Sure. And I wonder too if there's also an argument that maybe people subconsciously don't want to do what she did, and they don't want to meet this new person and embrace this new person and learn more about this new person because they might like what they see, like what they hear, find interest. It's easier to go la 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 la, come back to who you used to be, than risk, yikes, I actually like what I see over there. It actually makes a whole lot of sense. One of the biggest transformations I ever went through as a person was when I was in college. I thought for sure I was this type of person politically and spiritually. That's who I was. And then I joined the debate team, and the style of debate that I did was they would give you the topic and they would tell you what side you were on, and you still needed to win. You needed to do enough research. And I remember doing research and finding out like, oh, I don't actually think that's true or that's right. Oh, wait, I don't actually believe that. Oh, that is kind of a left-leaning thought or a left-leaning idea. Oh, no. And I remember there was a period where I put my foot down and I was like, no, this is who I am. This is who I am. I don't care about the facts and evidence and things that I'm reading. No, this is who I am. And then finally, one day I was like, let's figure out why am I hiding this? Like, let's figure out what this all means. And it changed me as a person. And I'm glad that it did. But that period was so scary where I felt like I was not being myself, or I was abandoning myself, or I was letting people down by admitting that actually I have much different social, political, spiritual beliefs than I was raised to have. You feel like you're hurting people by following that as well. And so I wonder sometimes if people see their relatives going through these transformations, and instead of saying, who is this person that I thought I knew this whole time? Let me get to know them. They say, no, it's a cult. Yeah. It's a cult. We got to get them out. We got to get them back.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it goes back to that like desire to imagine that you're not vulnerable.
Right.
Right. And I think that the recognition that sometimes things that you may not believe wholesale, maybe you don't want to go move into the commune and change your name and, marry someone and shave your head. But some things of that belief make sense. It can be terrifying. It can be really terrifying. So part of the violence of the desire to correct the cult is the fear that some of it makes sense.
Yeah.
And if some of it makes sense, you have to challenge all kinds of things about yourself.
Yeah, you want it to make no sense.
Exactly.
You want to continue to go, ew, crazy, right? How weird is that? I could never. But then you start to relate to people and see yourself in people and identify with things. And you're like, no, wait, stop. That's not how this works. Am I joining? What's going on? And it's fascinating to watch the ways that people deal with those feelings. Some people kind of explore it. Some people become fascinated with it. Some people just, nope, want nothing to do with it. Everybody's awful who follows that path. So when students take your course, what is the main takeaway that you want them to have when it's all over? Is there an idea or like a thought process you want them to follow, or a suggestion you make? What do you want them to take with them once they've left your class?
I want to give them the tools to see themselves and the world differently. And by that, I mean to ask more complicated questions about the phenomenon in front of them. So if we begin with, is that a cult? Which is usually the first question they ask. They'll say, what about this? Is that a cult? That as a starting question is a terrific question, but it cannot be the question with which we answer like the real things, right? So I want them to think about what the self is, what we want, how we live in worlds that constrain that want, how different forms of belief might come to be normalized because of historical, political, social circumstances, while others come to be marked as violent or wrong. I want them to think about how narrative, how the story we tell about a group or a belief produces a kind of reality, but that is not necessarily what's happening. That within the narrative, lots of things are occluded and limited. And so we need to get inside and say, why is it that we have contained our understanding of this phenomenon so powerfully within a single story of this is a cult? So I know where it starts, I know what happens in the middle, and I definitely know how it ends. So what I want them to be able to do is actually pull apart that story and ask other questions. What do people believe? How do people come to believe this thing that the rest of their world seems to think is wrong? How do they sustain that belief? What is the cost to them? How do they bear the cost inside themselves? How does someone decide to stay or go? What do they do to make sense of leaving when they still believe? These are the kinds of questions that we need to be asking. And they're the kind of questions that also help us understand what it is we want. Because so much of our obsession with cults is less about the cult itself and much more about the ways in which we're looking to meet all kinds of needs in our lives. So it's in asking those more complicated and messy and implicating questions that we can get to that.
Right. And then once they've asked those questions and maybe they get answers, whether they like them or they don't, what do they, in your opinion, what would you suggest someone do with that information? Or is it like a lifelong journey
Yeah,
that never really ends?
I mean, I have my students for 15 weeks.
Yeah.
There's a limit to what we can do in that time, but also I'm, again, not interested in prescribing for them what they will do and believe. It's a real gift to teach at Berkeley because my students are remarkable readers of the world. They're very savvy thinkers, but also I think, and it is generational largely, they're astoundingly empathetic.
Yes.
They're surprisingly open-minded. And my own biases and sense of myself as a particular kind of person and thinker and reasoning figure, I actually am a challenge. I'm a limit to what they might do and think. So I try very much to give them tools and then get out of their way, because I think they have a capacity to understand the world and these phenomenons in rich, nuanced ways. And I don't want to actually curtail the kinds of conclusions that they're going to come to.
Interesting. And do you think by exploring this empathy and by kind of getting these tools that they need, do you think that is one small step in the direction of making the world more empathetic or just making people understand each other more?
I wish I believed that my class, which it's a couple hundred students a semester. Its scale is large and very, very small, can do that. No, but I think that this is actually also the work of kind of critical thinking.
Yeah.
Ideally, does critical thinking cultivate a kind of empathy? I hope so. But my ambitions are fairly modest for what we do in that regard. But yes, if it produces less partisanship and less kind of reactive and violent perspectives on difference, terrific. That would be a great thing.
Yeah. Awesome. Awesome. Well, this has been a really fascinating conversation. Thank you so much for sitting down with me and sharing your thoughts. I felt like I got a sense of what your thoughts and perspectives were by reading some of your interviews in the past. And I watched a couple of videos, but I feel like hearing it from you first person has been a much deeper dive into this topic and the nuance behind cults, cult members, what it's like to be on the outside, what it's like to be on the inside, but more specifically, the harms in simply labeling something a cult and discarding it, or labeling something a cult and almost, for lack of a better term, like the freak shows of the day back in the day that used to travel, looking inside at people as though you could never possibly be them, and you're just watching this content that you claim to hate, but also can't stop watching and have like a whole playlist about. And I just thought your perspective was very interesting and unique and very empathetic. So thank you. I said all that to say thank you for sharing your time with me. I really appreciate it.
It's been a pleasure. Thanks so much, Sydney.